Welcome to the Black Archives Safe at Home virtual series. My name is Louis Berthen. I am the assistant archivist, and today we're going to be doing my segment, which is called the Legacies, Profiles in Greatness, and we're going to be talking about the Reverend Canon Theodore Gibson. Here's a photo of him for those who joined in. So let's get started. So Theodore Gibson was born on April 24th, 1915 to Charles and Effie Gibson here in Miami. However, at 3 months of age, he was sent to live with his grandparents, Ezekiel and Harriet, in Georgetown, Exuma, the Bahamas. This was a very formative time for the young Theodore because his grandfather was a lay leader for the Episcopal faith on the island, and according to Gibson, he was a man of strong faith and a great sense of right and wrong. So Gibson returned to Miami in 1924, and he attended school here in Overtown. He graduated from Booker T. Washington Senior High School in 1934, which, for those of you who don't know, is still standing today. It is known as Booker T. Washington, but is only a senior high school. So it was at this point that he made the decision to become a reverend. His other option was to become a lawyer. He decided against it because he felt that preachers were making more of an impact than lawyers were at the time. And in 1934, I don't think he was wrong. So we had talked about on this segment previously, we had talked about R.E.S. Toomey. But even though R.E.S. Toomey was a pioneer in the legal field here in Miami, being the first black lawyer, he still couldn't present his briefs in court. He had to send white lawyers to do it for him. So, and conversely, the Reverend here at the time, Reverend John E. Comer, was making great waves in Miami. He single-handedly got the Miami Herald to do an expose on the conditions here in Miami. And that almost directly led to the Liberty Square project and the federal money being injected here in Miami. So in terms of people making more of an impact, preachers, Reverend Comer did make a huge impact. So that definitely would have been a decision maker for the young Gibson. So when the bishop asked him why he wanted to become a priest, he responded, "I didn't say I heard a call from the Holy Ghost or anything like that." He said, "I wanted to serve the black people." So he continued his education, attending St. Augustine College in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Bishop Payne Divinity School in Virginia, which is now part of the Virginia Theological Seminary. He served his early time in the ministry in the Eastern Carolinas and in Hampton, Virginia, before returning to Miami in 1945 to serve at Christ Episcopal Church in Coconut Grove. And starting in 1954, he began his service as the president of the Miami chapter of the NAACP, and he served here for 10 years. Hi, Ms. Braden. Thank you for joining. Hi, Destiny's Affair. So I am talking about the Reverend Theodore Gibson. And now I'm just going to talk about some of the movements that he was involved with for civil rights here in Miami. So he was one of the men who led the fight to integrate Miami-Dade public schools. He actually filed a suit on behalf of his son, Theodore Gibson Jr., and this suit was filed in 1956. The school board litigated it for 3 years, doing nothing about it, arguing that schools were separate and equal. However, in 1960, he won that case. Dade County began limited and voluntary, quote-unquote, integration. It wasn't until 1963 that the school board had to start integrating schools in any meaningful way. And I'll read an article about this in a little bit, but we're going to talk about what was the result of this. So one of the first 2 schools to be integrated here in Miami-Dade was Orchid Villa. This school, within almost overnight, according to the article that I'm going to read you guys, became a predominantly black school. Because when the first black students started attending, white families started taking out their students and enrolling them in other schools or moving. And you also have at this time the rise of private schools. The rise of private schools and integration are very intimately connected. So there's various other things that were going on at this time, but this suit being successful put him in the eyes of Senator Charlie Jones. So I'm going to read to you from this event now. So it was with the NAACP that one of the greatest fights of Reverend Gibson's life happened. In the 1950s, we have to remember that we are only a couple years removed from World War II. The U.S. had just ended its involvement in the Korean War in 1953, and this was all part and parcel of the Cold War. The U.S. viewed itself as a force fighting against communist ideals and expansion, and that was not just a fight that was happening abroad, that was a fight that was happening here at home as well. So many of you may know about communist hunting committees, very famous, but we had one of our own here in the Florida legislature. And Senator Charlie Jones was the leader of this communist hunting committee here in Florida. And he requested that Reverend Gibson turn over a list of his NAACP chapter members. And he refused. Thank you for joining me, Oscar JB1. And he refused this, and he was charged with being in contempt of the legislature and given a 6-month jail term in order to pay $1,200. This, as you could imagine, was a very difficult decision to make for a man who had a family, a young kid, and his wife. And in the midst of all this, his wife actually got cancer. So, because of these claims, both Reverend Edward Graham and Reverend Gibson were put in danger. They were threatened with cross burnings, bombings, and physical threats. Because of this, the Richmond Heights community came together and protected the Reverend's home. They actually blocked off the streets and searched cars that were coming towards his house in Richmond Heights. The community also came together and paid for his fine. And Gibson stood his ground, and he took the case all the way to the Supreme Court through many appeals. I'm going to read to you from the article, but he actually appealed it to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court had sided with the committee. And I'm going to read all that to you in a little bit. But at the end, when he got to the Supreme Court in Washington, Justice Arthur Goldberg, the case was decided by a 5-4 majority, and he said that the aim of the Jones Committee was not to find communists, but to destroy the NAACP. And this put the Reverend Gibson in the national spotlight. So I'm going to read to you from this article. Reverend Gibson cleared by the High Court. The Supreme Court in Washington today overturned the contempt conviction of the Reverend Theodore R. Gibson, president of the Miami branch of the NAACP. Justice Arthur Goldberg delivered the High Court's 5-4 decision throwing out the conviction. Gibson was convicted for refusing to produce a list of association members for a 1959 hearing by an investigating committee of the Florida legislature, headed by Charlie Jones of Starkey. The Jones Committee was looking into possible communist infiltration of the NAACP. G.E. Graves, attorney for the NAACP in Florida, said he is very glad the majority of the Supreme Court justices followed our position. Arthur Goldberg commented, "The utter failure to demonstrate the existence of any substantial relationship between the NAACP and the subversive or communist activity. Justice John Harlan dissented with an opinion in which Justice Potter Stewart, Tom Clark, and Byron White joined. In essence," Goldberg said, there is here merely indirect, less than equivocal, and mostly hearsay testimony that in years past some 14 people who were asserted to be or to have been communists or members of a communist front or an affiliated organization attended occasional meetings of the Miami branch of the NAACP and or were members of that branch. There was no claim made that the NAACP or its Miami branch was engaged in any subversive activity or that its legitimate activities have been dominated or influenced by communists. So we'll continue on. And so, like I said, Reverend Gibson was part of many other fights for civil rights here in Miami. So Reverend Gibson and G.E. Graves actually led a 2-year fight to integrate the city bus system here in Miami. That integration decision was rendered by U.S. District Judge Emmett Choate in 1957. In 1959, Reverend Gibson helped successfully desegregate the Miami Springs Country Club. I talked about that a couple weeks ago. The Miami Springs Country Club only allowed black men to play golf 1 day a week, which was a Monday. And the reasoning for that was because it would least affect business. So that same year, Miami City Manager Ira Willard opened all city facilities to blacks. In 1960, the courts desegregated all county-owned beaches and parks and this was actually thanks to Reverend Gibson and his swim-in demonstration at Crandon Park Beach in 1959. This also led to the integration of hospitals. And like I told you also in another segment, the first hospital to actually hire a black doctor was Mount Sinai in Miami Beach, and that was also in 1961. And in another fight that he led was in 1961. He led the fight to desegregate the downtown lunch counters and department stores by threatening sit-ins and other demonstrations. This affected places like Walgreens and Woolworths. So another thing that Reverend Gibson was responsible for was actually the adoption of a Miami ordinance in 1961 that required running water for all citizens, as well as the removal of old decrepit housing. So thank Reverend Gibson for the fact that we have running water. In 1972, Gibson was appointed to the Miami City Commission, and he served here for 9.5 years. He was celebrated for his achievements and was given an honorary law degree from St. Augustine College. In 1958, he was awarded the Certificate of Appreciation for outstanding work in presentation of civil rights by the NAACP Florida State Conference branches. And in 1961, the NAACP awarded him again for steadfast heroism and courage despite intimidation of threat and physical harm. In 1966, he was awarded the annual Brotherhood Dinner of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, with a special award for distinguished achievements in human relations. And finally, in 1968, he was canonized by the Diocese of South Florida, and he was the first black man to be honored in this way. So I'm going to read to you from a couple of articles that kind of give you an insight into the Reverend Gibson's life, his mindset, and the different challenges that he faced. So this was published by the Miami News, and the title is The Defender in Priestly Garb. It is traditional in the Episcopal Church that a young man applying for the priesthood is asked a number of searching questions. One of them is, why? When the Reverend Canon Theodore R. Gibson was asked by Bishop Wing in 1937, he told it like it was. I didn't say I had heard the call from the Holy Ghost or anything like that. I said I wanted to serve the black people. And he has served them well, and he is still telling it like it is. Father Gibson has gotten his people indoor plumbing and outdoor recreation and freedom of the buses and lunch counters in Miami, where he was born a fetal age ago. His voice, more than any other, was the strong voice raised against police brutality and slumlords and separate but unequal schools. His the strong hand that struck down white-only signs on the restrooms and drinking fountains. Plumbing, says Theodore Gibson, a man of humor after all the trouble he has seen in 53 summers, has cost his country a fortune. This next part is titled, Pragmatism Tempers Zeal. My life is bound up with the people I serve, Father Gibson says. I have done what I believe is right and just and fair, and my salvation is in that. The cool pragmatism that tempers Father Gibson's fervid zeal as a bare-knuckles reformer came early. He even bent the truth slightly when he was telling the bishop why. The ministry, he admits, was not especially my choice. I wanted to be a lawyer, to plead the cause of the Negro people. But there was one Negro lawyer here, and they wouldn't let him go to court. And the black clergy raised all kinds of hell. They could make public officials listen. The white man, for some reason, seemed to think the black clergy had direct contact with God. So I took the priesthood, and I wanted to plead the case of the black man in the right court. In the circumscribed ghetto of Theodore Gibson's childhood, there was not the pronounced hatred he battled 10 or 15 years ago. Negroes accepted the menial jobs. My mother washed and cooked and ironed for the Brickles to send 4 of us to college, and we didn't exert our concerns to push for our rights. Gibson learned early, however, that it could be done. He was an acolyte then for the first sexton of St. Agnes Episcopal Church. The pastor was the Reverend Johnny Comer, and Father Gibson says he was with it. So now this second part of the article is going to talk about what was going on with Reverend Gibson during the whole Communist Hunting Committee charges. But Gibson did hurt inside. I'm thankful for my bishop, Henry Lewitt, a white man. One day when I was very lonely, he spoke to me at a camp. If you don't fight for it, he said, you'll never get it. Keep on. And that's all. And he walked away. That was a hell of a thing for him to say. He was my friend. He could have made it tough for me. They, the church hierarchy, didn't want that jazz. In December 1960, the Florida Supreme Court upheld Gibson's conviction and the sentence. 6 months and $1,200 fine. Circuit Judge W. May Walker assured Gibson the sentence was not a matter of racial dispute, but your persistent refusal to respect branches of the government of Florida. How many times have we heard that? So it was in any case a low watermark in Theodore Gibson's personal limbo. Everything he had worked for since he was an acolyte at St. Agnes when 3rd Avenue was Avenue H was going to shrivel and die in a cell in Leon County Jail. I was ready to give up, or crack up, Gibson said. I went to Nassau to relax. I saw the black people there, waving the planes in, working at ticket counters. What could they do in Florida? Pick up the bags. I will continue. So, on April 2nd of 1962, the Supreme Court called for a re-argument. Father Gibson said he was happy about the new hearing, but actually he felt guilty and constrained. His first wife was dying of cancer when he had to talk with his son, then 15. Father Gibson now felt sure that he was going to prison. I'm sure you feel that I haven't given you enough time, he told his son. I hope you'll forgive me and be proud that you have a father you can lend to others. "I think it was the first time he ever saw me cry," Father Gibson said. "The news came finally on March 25th, 1963, and it was good." The real object of the investigation, Justice Arthur Goldberg said in his opinion for the 5-4 majority, was not to find communists, but to expose the NAACP. The committee, by its own claim, already knew which alleged communists it had in mind. Justice Hugo Black wrote, "The right of association includes the privilege to associate with communists or anti-communists, or with people of all kinds of beliefs, popular or unpopular. We fought him like a dog," Father Gibson said of Black, an Alabaman of traditionally unreconstructed views, when he was appointed to the High Court in 1937. "Sometimes the position gives the man the opportunity to bring out the best in him. If the NAACP file can be ransacked because some communists have joined it," said Justice William O. Douglas, "then all the walls of privacy are broken down." So we're going to continue, and this little article was posted in 1976, and it gives an insight into a lot of the civil rights activities that Gibson was involved in. So in 1956, a man called me on the phone and said he was coming over to kill me. When I told my neighbors, they blocked the street off and searched every car that came in. The convictions were later overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. But by that time, most of the fights had been won. In 1958, Gibson and attorney Grattan Graves boarded a Metro bus in Coconut Grove and sat immediately behind the driver. An appeals court in New Orleans had just upheld a ruling by U.S. District Court Judge Emmett C. Choate in Miami that back of the bus segregation was unconstitutional. That same year, the NAACP won a court fight to have the Miami Springs Public Golf Course integrated. The following year, Black started using beaches that had previously been reserved for all whites, and the all-white Orchid Villa Elementary School was integrated. In fact, as a result of a court suit brought by Gibson, who wanted his son, Theodore Jr., enrolled in an all-white school. Now listen to this part. David Hawthorne, president of the Dade County Property Owners Association, said at the time, "The NAACP will find that white parents won't send their kids to integrated schools," and indeed, Orchid Villa almost immediately became all Black. So, I actually have a photo here from when Reverend Gibson and G.E. Graves decided to board the bus. So I'm going to show you that. And this was posted along with this article, but this happened in 1950. And hello, Josephine Stephan. Thank you for joining. We're talking about the Reverend Gibson. So this is him right here next to Graves. And this is them protesting back of bus seating here in Miami. And the last thing I do want to bring up here is integration in schools, because now we're talking about Orchid Villa. And like I said, he won that case in 1960. And the school board had gone in voluntary integration. So I'm going to read to you this article and kind of outlines what the problem with it was, right? So integration pace hit here. Gradual integration of Dade County schools with relatively little fuss and fanfare and no incidents pleases school authorities, but the NAACP brands the progress to date as mere token integration. On Wednesday, the school board will consider applications from 92 Negroes to enter 19 public schools, 8 of which have not had Negro pupils, and 1 of which is new. The board had already agreed to informally accept them, and when the school reopens in September, the change will raise the number of Negroes integrated into white schools to about 2,500 in 32 schools. Altogether, almost 190,000 youngsters, white and Negro, attend 200 schools in Dade. 32 out of 200 is not good. That is not a good statistic. And 2,500 out of 190,000, I would like to see the actual breakup of those numbers. And we have collections in the archives that do spell out how difficult this fight was. But I'll continue. The Reverend Theodore Gibson, president of the Dade branch of the NAACP, see only a few bright spots in this picture. He said, "This is an accomplishment in that it enables the school board and other public officials to point with a degree of pride and salve their consciousness. But in the real sense, none of them have come to grips earnestly and honestly with this problem, nor have they given the Negro what he is entitled to under the court decision, either by spirit or intent." The NAACP had to take the school board to court to get the integration program started in the first place, he pointed out. "If the board had given us this piecemeal integration without litigation, I might have rejoiced. As it is, I am infuriated at the lack of sincerity on the board's part. They've made just enough motion to fool the court, but I don't think that any court in its right mind after all these years can genuinely look at the situation and say there's been compliance and good faith. Now, so that was the positive view. Now we'll get ready for his discontent. Reverend Gibson's discontent with Day's actions on the school desegregation covers several aspects. The piecemeal assignment of Negro children to predominantly white schools, a few at a time, sometimes only one to a school. Loneliness can be an awful thing, Reverend Gibson commented ruefully. Psychology, it's bad. The schools have signs saying the child is our first concern, but in reality, political expediency is their first concern. This is something we're still seeing today. Literally, most of the news this week has to do with that. There are still Negro children who must pass white schools on their way to Negro children who must pass white schools on their way to Negro schools. What about the white youngsters who live closer to Negro schools, but continue to go to white schools, he asked. The failure of the school board to put qualified Negro teachers in white schools. You can't have integration with only the student body being integrated, Reverend Gibson said. Proportionately, more Negro teachers hold master's degrees than white teachers, and most of them got the degree at white schools. Surely some must be qualified to teach white children, he said, with a touch of sarcasm. A white principal has been assigned to one Negro school and white teachers are to be assigned there, but the principal has been given a model school. Why didn't they put him in a school with a lot of problems, he asked. They will use this deviously and insidiously against Negro principals, he predicted. The new principal is now recruiting the best trained teachers for his school, and white principals can get all the teaching aids they want, but not the Negro principals. So we'll cut that there. And at a dinner that was celebrating his retirement from politics, the Reverend Gibson said this: "You and I have the opportunity of a lifetime to live in this tri-ethnic community. I am eternally grateful for this ethnic composition. You don't like people you don't know. You don't love people you don't have dealings with. We have a great opportunity to teach a lesson to the rest of the country." And he ended his speech with this: "Too many of us think we're free just because we made some gains years ago. There's always room to serve. You can always serve the public one way or another, and this community belongs to all of us. We are still going forward. Life isn't easy. Life was never easy, but we are going forward." And that brings us pretty much to a close. I will answer any questions that are posted in the comments, but I feel that I have to answer this from a personal standpoint. I myself am a product of Miami. I was born, I was raised here, I attended Miami-Dade public schools, and I didn't know how much I have to give thanks to Reverend Gibson for what he fought for. I think because as many things as I can complain about and say negatively about Miami, one of the things I genuinely love about this place is that I got to grow up around so many different kinds of people and got to enjoy so many different kinds of culture. And that is something that I have to give thanks to Reverend Gibson, because had the white people who had lived here at the time, I mean, I know I look white, but I am Hispanic. My parents are immigrants. So who knows what would have happened. And I have to give thanks for not only being able to go to an integrated school, thanks to Reverend Gibson, and to have running water in my house, also thanks to Reverend Gibson. I have to pick a bone with the school system. Why is it that this version of history is not taught in our schools? Why is it that in my school I learned the whitewash sanitized version of history? Why is it that Martin Luther King came along and everything was fixed? That's not the way it happened. Look how hard Reverend Gibson had to fight for this. Look how hard everyone had to fight for these rights and how they had to keep fighting and keep going. I would have appreciated to have learned about Reverend Gibson and the sacrifices that he made and what he had to face to get what we get to enjoy today. So thank you guys for listening to me. I appreciate it. Miami Gardens Now, thank you for joining in. I apologize, I just finished up. I'm talking about the Reverend Theodore Gibson, his many sacrifices for the Miami community. And if I have any questions, and I agree, Miss Brandon, so many need to understand this. So many people, I mean, it's not even a lack of understanding. Is people don't know this. And it really does point out the disservice that Miami-Dade has done to its own history by whitewashing it this way. Why is it that we don't talk about these people? Why is it that you have to visit an archives and look through files to learn about these people? This is something that should be publicized. They should be proud of this. That is, I mean, in a lot of ways for me, is what is a true Americanism, is fighting against oppression of any kind. So, in my eyes, Reverend Gibson is a true patriot, not people who sit there and say that they're not going to wear masks because it infringes on their rights. That's not a patriot. A patriot's a man who fights for the rights of everyone. When he sees a person oppressed, he fights for that. So, no worries. The replay is going to go up right after this. And you should watch it. Reverend Gibson was an excellent man, and he fought for a lot of things. So, for the people who are here, though, I will show you some of these articles. So this was when the Reverend Gibson was cleared by the High Court. So this one was posted in 1963. This was the photo of him protesting the back of bus segregation, and he had fought for that with G.E. Graves. This is another article from 1963. This is Integration Hit Here, which is what I was reading to you guys from. Gibson's firm ideals, but was he hurt inside? This is talking a little bit about his life. And that pretty much covers it. So thank you guys for listening to me today. Remember that tomorrow we have virtual field trips with the director Timothy Barber. And tomorrow night at the Lyric Theater MIA page, we have our Lyric Live from the Living Room edition with DJ H2 and cello. It's always a lot of fun. Please join in for that. And on Saturday at 11, we have Storytime in Color with Camila Pritchett. So please join us for that. It's going to be great. And thank you guys for listening to me. I know it was a little long-winded today, but I hope it was worth it. So thank you and have a good one.